around 100 people die from gunshot wounds, many of them from suicides, others from homicides and accidental shootings. This is a daily epidemic in this country. And it's ridiculous to me that Congress only thinks that it has to act after one of these mass shootings occurs. And I've heard many of my colleagues, especially my Republican colleagues, in the last 2 weeks criticize certain measures like background checks because it won't specifically address America's mass shooting epidemic, ignoring the fact that if we put a downward pressure on the daily gun violence in this country, it can save just as many lives. But here we are again, in the wake of another epic scale mass slaughter. We are talking about the prospects for changing America's gun laws. The president, very quickly after the mass shootings, went to the press and said he was open to a conversation about background checks. During those first few days, I was on the phone with my colleagues, Republican and Democratic colleagues in the Senate, trying to explore whether we could revive background checks legislation, which failed in the Senate in 2013, or take up the bill that has already passed the House of Representatives. One weekend ago, the president called me and told me personally that he was indeed serious about moving forward together on what he called meaningful background checks legislation. The president told me that he knew that Republicans in the Senate wouldn't support it unless he supported a background checks measure, and he was committed to finding a way forward. After that, I had other conversations with the White House. My staff began to meet with the White House and other members who were interested in it. Several days ago, some of the president's comments seemed to suggest that he was once again backing away from his commitment to work on background checks legislation. This was familiar to many of us because we had seen it happen in Parkland. If you remember, after the Parkland shooting, the president convened myself and a handful of others at the White House and publicly committed to working together on background checks legislation at that time. He even seemed in that meeting to endorse proposals like assault weapons bans. The NRA came into his office about 24 hours after the Parkland meeting, and he changed his mind. And there were reports that he had been on the phone with members of the gun lobby, and that was in part what had changed his thinking. I have been in contact with the White House this week since the president's comments, as late as last night. And I believe that the White House is still committed to trying to work on a comprehensive anti-gun violence proposal that would include strengthening background checks. And I committed to the White House last night that I would work with them over the course of the next few weeks to try to find common ground on expanding background checks in this country. The White House confirmed to me that they are also interested in trying to find common ground on Senator Blumenthal's proposal to incentivize states to develop extreme risk protection orders, and that would hopefully be part of a broader package. Now, I am skeptical that these efforts are going to bear fruit. I think it's very hard to negotiate with this White House when the president's public positions seem to change by the day. And I'm sure there will be some people who will say I'm naive to think that we're going to end up getting a proposal through that will significantly expand background checks and be able to get 60 votes in the Senate. I'm going to try. I think it's my obligation as the primary sponsor of the background checks bill in the Senate to do so, but also because the stakes are so high. Because if we were able to dramatically expand the number of background checks that are processed in this country, for instance, at gun shows or through online sales, we would undoubtedly save lives. In states that have universal background checks, you have 30 to 40% less individuals who are killed by guns than in states that don't have those protections. And so I think it's important to spend some time trying to reach some common ground. I will say, though, that I'm skeptical that that process will eventually bear fruit. I'm hopeful that we're going to begin once again meeting with Republican and Democratic legislators and the White House next week, as we had begun to do last week, and that there will be something to report. If this all seems like a ruse, an attempt by the president to make it look like he's doing something without actually moving the ball down the field, I think we'll know that in fairly short order, but I want to make sure to give this all a try. Lastly, I've made it clear to the White House that if they are prepared to give the NRA veto power over this package, then it's not worth having even one meeting. Now, I don't know yet whether they are listening to me, but I will say in my conversation with the president, he understood that at the time he understood that what was a bill that would be meaningful would not likely be supported by the gun lobby, and I reiterated that to the White House this week. With that, listen, I'd be happy to open it up to questions. As I said, I think the chances of success here are less than 50-50, but I think it's worth giving this a shot, and I'm looking forward to the process that I think will begin over the course of the next several days.
Senator, do you think that there perhaps has been some mix-up in the president's mind and others, gun rights supporters, between the background check and the red flag law? Because I heard him use the term a slippery slope, which, as you know, if you read any of the emails, I'm sure you get the same ones that I get from these various groups. They say a slippery slope on this red flag means they're going to be able to take my guns away.
Right.
Once it starts, you can't stop. Do you think there's some mixing of the two proposals?
Well, I think the president's language is always vague and hard to follow on almost every issue he talks about. And it has been especially difficult to parse when he's talking about the issue of changing America's gun laws. I think he has an instinct to lead, but he's talking to the gun lobby much more frequently than he's talking to me. I think that there has been some confusion, and I just posted something on social media about this morning. I think there has been some confusion in the press about the difference between universal background checks and expanded background checks. There was a report in the press that the president had given up on universal background checks, and that was a reversal of his position. Well, to be clear, he had never actually said that he wanted universal background checks, meaning a background check on every single sale. That's something I support. But the proposal that came before the Senate in 2013 was not universal background checks. Manchin Toomey expanded background checks to cover most gun show sales and online sales, but it didn't cover every commercial sale. And yet it was a worthwhile proposal that I voted for. So I think in general there's been some confusion over the wording and the phrasing that the president has used and what that has meant for as to whether people believe they are still interested in moving forward.
So, Senator, you've given this a 50-50 chance, and obviously
give it a less than
50-50 chance. Okay, I'll be specific about that. And we can understand why you would be skeptical. What is there that the White House has been telling you that makes you optimistic?
Well, I mean, the president and the White House has been clear that they are willing to support background checks legislation that might not today be popular in the Republican Party. I mean, the president and the White House has made it clear that they are open to leading on this issue and trying to bring Republicans along with them. Now, again, that's what the president said after Parkland, and he ended up doing the opposite of leading. He folded. And that may be what happens a week from now or 24 hours from now. But I guess that's what has given me some optimism, that they have expressed interest on supporting something that would be stronger than what the broad cross-section of the Republican Senate caucus would be willing to support today.
And is that because of public support for this issue?
Yeah, so right. I mean, back up as to why we're here, right? Why is it even a possibility that the president is going to support a background checks bill and try to bring some Republicans along. It's because this has become a voting issue for swing voters in this country. If you want to win the presidency in 2020, you can't be in the pocket of the gun lobby. If you want to win a seat for Congress in the 2020 elections, you can't be owned by the gun industry. You have to show that you are willing to take them on. You're willing to support things like universal background checks that are supported by 90% of Americans. And that has changed, admittedly. That was not the case even in 2016. In 2016, background checks were popular, but there weren't a tidal wave of voters that were turning out to cast their vote on this issue. And the 2018 elections were the first elections in which you saw in the exit polls that guns was a dominating issue for voters. In fact, for voters that voted for Democrats in the 2018 election, and that was most voters, healthcare was the #1 issue, guns was the #2 issue, which is extraordinary. I don't know that guns would have been on the top 8 list before the shooting in 2012 here in Connecticut. And so our movement is becoming stronger. Voters care much more about gun violence when they come to the polls, and I think that the president and to a certain extent Mitch McConnell recognizes that. The other interesting nugget here is that Senator McConnell, who has been an unconditional supporter of the gun lobby, has opened the door to background checks legislation in the Senate should the president come to an agreement. And that, listen, I've not talked to Senator McConnell. I don't want to read too much into it, but I think it's interesting that Senator McConnell is opening the door to a background checks bill in the Senate. My guess is he's doing that because he recognizes this could be a real political vulnerability for a lot of his members if they just stand on the sidelines, shooting after shooting.
But do you expect that commitment to translate into, actual votes coming forward, or just another debate?
Well, listen,
or committee legislate.
Well, my belief is that if Donald Trump gets behind a background checks reform bill, it will pass the Senate. So I think that that's the simple political math here. Republicans are not going to want to fight the president on a wildly popular background checks reform bill. So, so this is really ultimately up to the president as to whether he wants to support something that will pass the Senate. If he does, I think so. That's the question. And if he doesn't, if the White House sort of walks away from negotiations, then I don't think there's any chance we'll get the Republican votes in the Senate for a background checks bill.
Senator, several weeks have passed and lapsed since the latest mass shootings. By the time Congress reconvenes, are you concerned that that moment has passed?
Well, like I said at the outset, I think it's disgusting that the only time we can seriously talk about changing the nation's gun laws is after a mass shooting, when there are 100 people dying every single day from gunshots in this nation. But you're not wrong. There is this ebb and flow of interest in legislating on guns, depending on how close we are to the last mass shooting. So yes, there is a risk that by the time we get back into session after Labor Day, there will be 2 or 3 other crises that will be dominating the narrative, which is why I have been fairly persistent in keeping in touch with the White House to try to set up a process so that we can be sitting and talking to each other over the course of the next few weeks to try to come up with a proposal. So I think there's certainly danger that we will move on to another crisis that's dominating the headlines, but I'm hopeful that we'll at least be working behind closed doors in the coming weeks.
Senator, what would you consider to be meaningful background checks? And do you run the risk of maybe agreeing to something that doesn't really do all that much, and then this opportunity is lost?
Yeah, I guess I won't negotiate against myself in public, but I set out at the beginning that there is a difference between a universal background checks bill, which I support, which has passed the House of Representatives, and a bill that expands background checks. And I am open to taking the 2013 legislation and trying to improve upon it. Now that might not ultimately be HR 8 or my background checks legislation, but there's some version of Manchin Toomey that could be improved upon that would be meaningful and would be significant and would undoubtedly save lives. Now, the easiest thing is for the president just to endorse the bill that's already passed the House of Representatives, and if he did, it would pass the Senate. I'm sure of that, because that bill has 90% public support. But there's certainly something in between Manchin Toomey and HR 8.
Senator, what are your thoughts on the president calling for more psychiatric hospitals and chief mental health registries?
Well, what I do understand that the White House, wants to have a broader conversation and include mental health proposals in this package. If the president and the White House are talking about reinstitutionalizing the mentally ill, well, that's a non-starter. And that would probably be the quickest way to shut down these negotiations. The president talks so recklessly and irresponsibly about people with mental illness. He constantly conflates people who are mentally ill with people who are violent, when in fact the opposite is true. People who have been diagnosed with mental illness are much more likely to be the victims of a violent attack than to be the perpetrator of it. And in fact, less than 5% of people who ever lethally hurt someone else are diagnosed with a mental illness. So I'm concerned about the statements he's made. They're not, they're not unfamiliar to me. I've heard them make them before, and I would hope that we're not going to even begin a conversation about the rebuilding of mental institutions in this country.
Does the challenge of finding a compromise and passing a compromise, at least on the limited issue of background checks, get harder as we move closer to the November 2020 elections, as we move closer to the primaries, to the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, South Carolina?
Well, I don't think it gets harder in the sense that many of the traditional opponents of background checks are feeling the heat to do something because of the upcoming elections. So I think as the political heat gets hotter as the 2020 elections approach, a lot of Republicans are going to be more interested in having a positive vote on anti-gun violence measures on their record. We do have a lot of senators running for president, and sometimes compromises aren't terribly popular amongst people who are running in partisan primaries. And so, admittedly, I think you have to admit that that could be an issue. If you put a compromise on the table, there would certainly be some people on the right and the left who would see political gain to be had in opposing that compromise. But part of the reason that I want to be in the room is that, I'm a hardliner on the issue of anti-gun violence measures. I have the most expansive, aggressive background checks bill before the Senate, and I'm willing to sit down and talk. And hopefully I can signal to my colleagues who I think trust me on the issue of gun violence that if I'm willing to sit down and talk, then there must be something worthwhile to talk about.
And which of your Republican colleagues in the Senate do you think would be able to stand up to the gun lobby?
I don't want to go down the list.
But you must have had conversations with some of them.
Yeah, I have, and again, I think many of them are. I think the broad reason why there is nothing happening in the Senate legislatively right now is because Senate Republicans don't know where Donald Trump stands on a variety of issues, and so they don't want to start down a legislative path and then have the president come out against them. And so I think there's a general unwillingness amongst Senate Republicans to legislate because of uncertainty about where the president stands. And there is big uncertainty right now as to where the president stands on the issue of gun violence. So if the president ends up taking a stand and saying, this is a proposal I support, I think there's a lot of Republicans in the Senate who would get behind it. And you know, that's my sense in the conversations that I've had, that very few of them want to go out on a limb without knowing that the president is there to support them. And again, chances are less than 50-50 the president will get there. Now the exception here is Pat Toomey, who I've talked a lot with in the last 2 weeks. Pat Toomey is willing to lead. He's willing to sit down with Democrats in the White House, and he's a very conservative Republican who's very well respected among Senate Republicans, and so it's very important to have him as a partner in all of this.
After your initial conversation with the president himself, with whom are you dealing, and how do you know that person has this ear?
Yeah, so I mean, I and my office have talked with a number of people at the White House, but we're talking with the top legislative staffers at the White House who are talking directly to the president. So you know, we are, and again, those staffers have not delivered a lot of legislation over the course of the last year, but we're talking to the top legislative people there.
Were you surprised when you got that call?
Yeah, I was. I was surprised. I had reached, admittedly, I had reached out to the White House a few days before and had said, listen, if the president is really interested in working on background checks, then as the sponsor of the bill in the Senate, I'd be willing to sit down and talk. So I had reached out first to tell the White House that I was interested in talking to them, and then the president called me, I guess that Sunday, it wasn't a long conversation, but we did get down into some of the details about the policy, but also about the politics, what needed to happen in order for this to ultimately pass, and then the staff followed up very quickly after that phone call to start to get into a discussion about what they were thinking about, what we were thinking about.
Senator,
How does it come up on your
what can
phone?
President
Does it
Trump-
come up
Does
White
it come up
House?
on my phone? Yeah.
Did it come up White? I mean, did he call your
Yeah,
cell
I don't
phone,
remember.
or was it a?
I don't remember. So.
Well, the central switchboard is something 1400.
Like, did you
Right.
know it was him when you
It
answered
wasn't,
the
wasn't
phone?
his cell phone.
No, it was somebody from the White. No, it was somebody.
Okay, so somebody from the White House and
somebody
then connected you
from the White
to
House
the.
saying the president's
Okay,
on the
gotcha.
on
Sorry.
the line, and it took a couple times. I think he was. I was in Old Lyme, which does not have great reception. He was somewhere that also did not have great reception, so it took a couple times before we connected.
Senator, what can President Trump do to encourage, skittish Republicans in the Senate?
He can get behind a specific proposal. I think so long as he is talking vaguely about his support for background checks or extreme risk protection orders, very few Republicans are going to want to get on board. The only way that we pass a bill in the Senate is if there is a proposal with words on a piece of paper that the president says he's for and says it for more than 24 hours at a time, right? I mean, the president is going to have to make a sort of a ongoing commitment to a piece of legislation, and he's going to have to talk with Republicans about why he supports it. And again, that's why I'm not overly enthusiastic, but this is different. This is, in Parkland, it took literally 24 hours before the president reversed his position. And I do think it's significant that after there was a 24-hour period in which the news was the White House is giving up on gun measures, they did make an effort, both publicly and privately, to walk that back and to correct the record. I do think that suggests that there is some more willingness today than there was a few years ago.
So, Senator, you see that the president's word is going to have a much larger effect on this effort in the Senate than public opinion or support?
I do. I mean, listen, I think Republicans are totally flummoxed by this issue right now because it wasn't so long ago when they could ignore 90% of their constituents and feel no impact at the polls. And the Republican Party and the gun lobby are just are so intertwined and interlocked together. It's very hard to pull those two entities apart. And so Republicans know they're on the wrong side of the electorate on this, and they know they just lost a whole bunch of elections over the issue of gun violence. But their connection to the gun lobby is a really hard habit to break. And so they're having trouble doing that right now. And I can't exactly explain it, but it's been difficult for them to sort of turn this big ship around in open waters, and it may be it may only be that the leader of their party can be the forcing mechanism to make them do that, other than elections, which will eventually remove them from power.
Did you communicate that to the president, saying you have to be the one to say that?
I did, and if you remember when I was at the White House in 2017 in that televised meeting, that's exactly what I told him while the TV cameras were running. I said, Mr. President, you have to support something. You have to move Republicans to the table, and that's the only way that it will pass. And so I did tell him that on the phone. Like I said, I think he recognizes that he's got a unique role to play here, but I don't think it was news to him because I had said it to him before.
Which seems to have a better chance, the background check or the red flag?
Probably extreme arrest protection order. I mean, I do think that has a better chance of passing. I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to what that is yet, and I am very interested to see what the sort of final legislative product is. My worry about extreme risk protection orders is that if all it is incentives for the states, then are those incentives big enough to convince a Republican governor and a Republican state legislature to adopt a law that the NRA opposes? So extreme risk protection orders are not supported by the NRA. Most of these red states have legislatures and governors who have pledged fealty to the NRA. And I just want to make sure that we don't pass a law that we think will lead to the adoption of more extreme risk protection orders, but actually doesn't, because it doesn't end up actually changing the politics in these states. There is a version of the extreme risk protection order that involves a federal extreme risk protection order. So you would have an ability as a parent or a neighbor to go and get a federal order. That would certainly be impactful because that would be immediately available to everyone in the country, regardless of what their state legislature does. So politically, I think this is an easier lift, but the policy is tricky to make sure that we're doing something that's really impactful and meaningful. But we know our version of the law in Connecticut has made a big difference.
Were you in the state senate then when it passed here? Because it was about 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I was, and I was there for 4 years, so I don't think I was there in the past. Okay, thank you everybody, appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks for your time.